Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is maybe our 8th Ideas in Action for One World, and I'm so excited that tonight I'm joined by two fearless, incredible sheroes of mine. First, we have Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who is a marine biologist, policy expert, writer, and Brooklyn native. She is founder and CEO of Ocean Collective, a consulting firm for conservation solutions grounded in social justice, and founded the Urban Ocean Lab, a think tank for future coastal cities. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. And now we'll also be joined by Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, an author, strategist, teacher, and named one of the 15 women who will save the world by Time Magazine. And hopefully today she'll tell us how to save the world.
It takes a village.
It takes a village. Thank you both so much for joining me tonight.
Nicole, it's really nice to see you.
Yeah. when Catherine and Ayana launched their book, I tried to join the launch celebration that night, the Zoom, and my Zoom would not work. I tried 4 times and was like, the universe doesn't want me to see them.
You missed a lot of crying climate experts.
Oh.
There's this upwelling of emotion and gratitude and relief and community that's been born with the book, and it's just been so beautiful to see that manifest itself in all different ways.
Well, I wanted to start with something I was reflecting on was the first time we talked about this book, and I kind of felt that I think my first feeling I felt was a little bit of relief in the sense oh, people are gonna help me understand. People are going to help me figure out how to help the world, And so, before we talk about anything with the book, I wanted to start with the title and how you guys got to the title, which feels like such a, it's led a lot of how you're thinking about this work.
Yeah. It wasn't easy. I mean, you were like, you guys need a title. We need to print this book. We need to put something on the cover. We were really sort of down to the wire on this. And the image that comes into my head, Catherine, when I think about the title is just us in this conference room late at night with a whiteboard in Brooklyn, just being like, it's time. We need a title, all of these different words, right? And trying to have this forward gaze and this solution orientation, but somehow not be cheesy, but not be overly sort of didactic or boring. And it was just a really hard needle to thread. And there's so many climate books out there that a lot of the names were taken. So it was just, there was a spreadsheet with just a lot of words that could fit. And then Catherine, do you remember any of the bad title options?
Oh yeah. I mean, there were so many bad ones. But I think Nicole, I would love to actually go back and look at when you sent that stanza from Natural Resources from Adrienne Rich's poem. Because I suspect it just was so right so early that then we swirled around all these other things. But for folks who haven't seen the book and maybe don't know that poem, it's the closing stanza, and it goes, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." And it just is so ethodically correct for this book. And our hearts are also moved by all we cannot save, and our days are motivated by all that we still can. And we know that's very much a we, right? It is any chance we have of any saving all depends on us kind of linking arms and working towards that possibility.
We wanted to make sure it wasn't too rosy, right? We can't save, the book is not called Saving Everything, right? That's no longer possible, but there's so much possibility. And we wanted to lean into like, okay, what does it look like if we get it right? You know, like what are the solutions? What are the stories that will inspire us to replicate what's working? Not just cautionary tales and sort of ever more detailed visions of what the apocalypse would look like, but you know, like what's next? Like, okay, like it's bad. What are we going to do about it? And so trying to bring that vibe to the book. And I think the subtitle really helps to round that out, right? So it's truth, courage, and solutions for the climate crisis. It's not like hope and optimism. It's like, let's be real. Like we need like the truth and the science, and like we need to face the facts. And with all of that with courage, because it's going to be hard, but like, let's just focus on solutions, like what we can actually do. And that trifecta, like I didn't appreciate the subtitle. It was just like, okay, yeah, that's clear and like not embarrassing. Like we went through a lot of options for that. But I've really grown to appreciate the subtitle. Like those 3 words sum up so much for me about like what motivates me, and sort of like what is the alternative to just hoping. Right? It's that trifecta.
I think something that has always kind of struck me about you two, and maybe some of my favorite writers in this way, is the honesty that you bring. And I think it's not just the honesty of saying, you know, it's bad, like it's really bad where we are now, but it's also the honesty in saying, but there's something we can do about it, you know? And so I think that double coin, I think too much when it comes to the climate crisis, we either hear, you know, it's terrible, or we should just be hopeful and turn off our lights when we leave the room, which we should do that and other things, you know? And I think this book balances that so well. So, I mean, of course, I want to talk about the contributors, which, you know, I feel like we could honestly spend the whole hour talking about them and their work. But, you know, first, how did you guys even go about starting that process? I mean, I think Ayana said, which I had to reflect on, like, I think it started with 20 and ended up with a lot more.
41. Yeah. Yeah. So,
and poets and art.
Yeah.
So this like quick little book project sort of grew and grew and grew and took over our lives for the last 9 months. It's been this sort of incredible gestation period. We started the day after Christmas, essentially, like emailing people and asking them if they would be a part of this thing that we weren't quite sure what shape it would take. And almost 9 months to the day later, the book was born into the world. So just, you know, for anyone out there who's thinking about doing an anthology with 41 essays and 17 poems and original illustrations and a dozen quotes, like don't do it in 9 months. Just don't, but don't try that. But, you know, Catherine and I spent a lot of time thinking about the diversity of perspectives we wanted to include, and sort of diversity in every sense of the word, right? Like all across the US, diversity of race and age. It's like, you know, from 15 to my mom's 76 and has a poem in the book. So at least 76 as the oldest. I don't know how old everyone is. You know, and areas of expertise. So the scientists and the farmers and the artists and designers and policy experts and lawyers and all of that, journalists. And there's just, I think the good part is there is such a wealth of talent and wisdom from women leading on climate. And there are so many different ways to participate in climate solutions that we were just like, 20 is not enough. And so, yeah, so then it was like 27 and like 35. And then, you know, next thing you know, it's 41. And you, Nicole, were like, you're done. That's it. All you get.
It's in production. It's done. Well, I don't know if I've ever asked you guys this, but, you know, we talked a lot about the diversity and, like you're saying, in age. Like I remember you know, it was important to add the youth climate activists, and, you know, it was important to add folks that were coming from the South and folks that were coming from the coastal cities. But I am curious how you guys went about approaching the different disciplines, because there's also lawyers, and then there's activists, and there's quote unquote like everyday people, you know. So I'm curious how you met these women, how it came together.
I mean, I think, you know, part of it is just drawing on, years spent in this movement, right? So I don't think either of us had ever tried to like map the contours of, you know, sets of superpowers in the movement, but like we kind of had that in the back of our mind. And certainly I think, you know, my other kind of part of my climate life is working on climate solutions with Project Drawdown. And so I'm always holding kind of those sectors in mind. And then, like, what are the different accelerators that we can use to move solutions forward, whether that's building social movements or reshaping culture and narratives or rewriting the rules, right, through policy or shifting capital. So, you know, I think we had a sense of kind of the terrain that we wanted to cover, and in some cases it was like, you know, we know a great person to bring that piece of the story to life. And there were others like litigation, where, you know, that was not someone like on speed dial for Ayana or for me, but was one on speed dial for Marianne Hitt, who we both know really well. And she graciously led us to Abby Dillon, who's the president of Earth Justice, and an incredible lawyer and litigator. And it turns out a really exquisite writer as well, and kind of thinker about the movement. So I think that was one of the really lovely things for us as editors, was getting to work really closely with people that we know and love, but also getting to build relationships with lots of people that we hadn't worked with before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was pretty magical, like how it came together. I mean, and to be clear, like there are 41 essayists in the book, but our spreadsheet of like potential people to include is like 100 people long. Like we could have made, you know, 3 volumes. There is just so much wisdom and talent. So this is not a book of like the women climate leaders. These are like some. But I think one of the things that Catherine and I got the most sort of good vibes out of was the fact that a lot of these women doing the most important work on climate had never written about their work before from the first person. They had written speeches, they had written press releases or like blog posts for their organizations, maybe op-eds, but they'd never told their own story. Mm-hmm. And to give people, just simply to ask them, like, what is the story you want to tell if you had a large audience, just led to such beautiful conversations. Like I'm thinking of Janie Bavishi, who is the director of resilience for the city of New York. Like, how are we going to adapt to our changing climate, to the sea level rise and storms and heat waves and flooding? And I met her because we were working together at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on ocean policy. She's worked in New Orleans and Honolulu, and she'd never written about her work publicly before. Because if you're a policymaker, you're all behind the scenes, right? And you kind of like can't write about your work because you can't sort of like reveal everything about that. But she took this on and wrote this exquisite piece about these 3 different coastal cities and the lessons that she's learned from working in each of them. And it was this real reckoning for her with like, what have I learned over the last decade? And like, what might some of the ways forward be? And it was such a gift to us to get to sort of see that unfurl, and also to her, because she's wanted, you know, like secretly wanted to, you know, to tell her own story. And so to have her, and the same with Marianne Hitt, who leads the Beyond Coal campaign at the Sierra Club, which has shut down like 320 coal-fired power plants in the US over the last decade. And like she led that and has never told her story and never talked about the lessons learned. And so that was the motivation for the book in the first place, right? Like Catherine, when we were walking together in the woods and just like, why aren't all these women getting more attention and money and like fame and like everything they need to like take all their work to the next level? It was like, because they're not like playing the thought leader game. They're just doing the work. And so how could that's, you know, so the book came up in us as this idea of like, if books are still a traditional path to thought leadership, like, let's bring the book to them.
You know, I feel like, which is no shade to any kind of anthology, but when we first started talking about this, you know, I did think of it as an anthology, meaning like a true collection, right? So it has a similar theme, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is speaking to one another. It doesn't mean that it's laying out this whole picture. But at the end of it, I mean, the things I learned in it, like, it's so interesting hearing you talk about Marianne Hitt, because when I read that, I was like, this is a movie. This is insane. There's like so many things. How have I never known about this? You know,
Right?
and like there's so many moments in this book. And I do think the way that, you know, it's all laid out, and the fact that I'm glad that there's 41 essays, because I also think it really does look like now a whole picture of the United States in a different way. You know, it really does, for me at least, feel less like an anthology per se, and more like a full book, you know, because I do think what you were doing, besides just asking the question, was you were really giving folks the permission to share their story, and you were doing it in, you know, kind of this, what we'll go into later, but this kind of classic like feminine way, meaning a way that's caring and honest and heart forward, which I think allowed for like some really beautiful pieces, you know. So, you know, just more power to you. So just before we go to the next thing, I you know, want to mention, because Catherine brought it up, the poems and the images, which I think from the beginning we always thought there was going to be images throughout, but poetry I think maybe came a little bit later. So if you guys could just talk about, you know, your decision to add both of those things, which I think people might think of as kind of a secondary, like, oh, this looks nice, piece, but it's actually, you know, a really radical tool that you guys utilized.
Yeah. Um, it's funny now. I'm like, I so can't imagine the book without poetry and without
Yeah.
the beautiful illustrations by Madeline Jubilee Saito. And that it's like hard for me to think back to like, what were we thinking when there wasn't going to be poetry? I have no idea. But I think it just sort of happened quite organically, because poetry has been important for both of us, in kind of wrapping our heads and hearts around, well, lots of things about life, but certainly about our relationship with this planet, and our responsibility to it and to one another. And so, yeah, I think like suddenly it just became this really joyous opportunity to reflect, a more like kaleidoscopic vision that, like, I think we're bringing with us day to day. We just have never seen that in a climate book before. And Madeline's art, we just felt so incredibly lucky, because there was a tweet about 30 days of climate comics that she had done, and we just fell in love with them and felt like this is so the spirit that this book is wanting to bring, and to have that expressed visually, but also, you know, they're kind of, she calls them poem comics, and so, you know, there's that poetry vibe in the art as well. What else would you add, Ayana?
I think, you know, because climate change is such a heavy topic, we like, in thinking about like how to lay out the book and design the book, inserting poetry and art, and there's also quotations. Like some pages, it's just like a quote from the CEO of Patagonia, from Elizabeth Warren, from, you know, whoever it is, to like adding like yet another voice and like yet another sort of like insight. And I think because climate change is like so big, right? I think our brains, are sort of like hearts and minds need a break between some of these essays. Like, how can we design a book that allows us to take a breath, right? And so after some of the particularly like intense essays, we were like extra thoughtful about like, okay, what comes next? Like if a person wants to keep reading, like how would we design the layout of this entire book so that people can keep going, right? So that you can like take a breath, have a moment of levity, have a moment of like feeling seen. A lot of poetry is like, oh, someone else has felt this before, I'll be okay. And just being able to weave this like quilt, as Catherine often says, of all of this work. And so the poetry, we had, again, like a longer list of poems we would have loved to include, but the poetry was selected not just for like which are our favorite or which are most like on topic, but like where are the places between essays where we need to take a breath, and which is the exact right breath for that spot. And I'm just remembering in like curating the poetry, this incredible poet, Denise Froman, had recommended this book called the Eco Justice Poetry Anthology. And it's like this thick. And so like back in January, we could like go to bars and read books and drink wine by ourselves, just like the thing I miss most. Not hanging out with other people, but just like hanging out near other people and like pretending to read books. I was flipping through it and like I made so many friends that night, because it's just like, what is an eco justice poetry anthology, and like, why are you reading this at a bar? And just it was such a pleasure. Like, I think as we were sort of wrapping up the editing of the essays, it was this really joyful phase of the work for me and Catherine to be able to sort of like celebrate the essays being almost done by like reading poetry as our job for a few weeks.
So, we've talked, it's pretty clear to everyone, I think, that all of the contributors are women. But of course, we want to hear you talk about, this collection started because there was this very clear, parallel between the climate movement and the feminism movement. And I don't think that everyone has seen that and everyone understands that. So if you guys could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. The eco-feminist kind of academic literature has been on this for a long time. And I would say like witches have been on it for many centuries, right?
Didn't see that coming. I've done a lot of interviews with Catherine. This is the first time she was.
I'm like, that's the quote of the night.
That's fresh. That's new.
Witches, they're the leading edge for climate solutions. Did you not know this?
So, I mean, I guess like I say all of that to say that, the analysis about like the inextricability of these things, like that has been laid for a long time. And I think this feels like a moment when it's kind of shifting into more kind of public discourse, which feels exciting. And also I think for us felt like we're standing on some real shoulders here, right? And so like trying to honor all of the thinkers and doers that have come before us. But mostly when you hear about the gender climate nexus, it is about women and girls and non-binary folks as victims, right? So if climate change is, as the Pentagon says, a threat multiplier, or you can think of it as a vulnerability or an injustice multiplier. Well, if you're in a society where you have imbalances of access to resources, power, et cetera, along the lines of gender, along the lines of race, along the lines of socioeconomic status, as of course we do, then the ways that the realities of climate change play out have really different impacts for people's lives and livelihoods and communities. But that's only like one piece of this story. And I think there are a couple of other really important pieces that have been, just not gotten as much attention. And one of them is that if we want to have the possibility of a gender equal world, that doesn't happen on a burning planet. So bold climate action is just as much a feminist priority as reproductive justice. hello, like if you don't have a planet on which to raise children safely, there, then reproductive justice isn't possible. So so that's one piece. And then the other that, we really try to lay out in the begin of the book is that the climate crisis is a leadership crisis. And part of that crisis is about how we understand the issue, how we think about the root causes, what that means for the kinds of solutions that are needed, and how we approach the work. And so we, have kind of our working framework of how we think of more feminine and feminist climate leadership. But that looks a lot like what just, feminism has been working on for a long time. And so it feels also like the climate movement is now really benefiting from those frameworks, those ways of thinking, the kind of cultivation of those strengths and values.
There's a quote in the book that just, it's on its own page. Actually, one of our funders for the book, we did some fundraising to make sure we could pay all of these essayists and poets as well as we could, and sort of launch it into the world with everything it needed. And as we were discussing the book with this philanthropist, she was describing sort of her daughter, her 12-year-old daughter's reaction to the climate movement, the climate strike movement, and the sign that her daughter made to go to the big climate strike in New York City last September. And her sign just said, "Me too," said Mother Earth.
Yeah.
"Me too," said Mother Earth. She's like at 12 years old, she was like, the Me Too movement and the climate movement are like totally connected. We are like absolutely abusing the planet in this like violent way. And we need to get it together. And so that is like one page of the book is just, her climate strike sign. And just, these Gen Z kids, like, it's like they came out of the womb with intersectionality, right? Like you don't have to explain it to teenagers. They're just like, of course it's all connected. And so, the way that I think about that in its simplest form is, who are we saving the planet for, right? And like, if we don't have all of these different people involved in designing what the future looks like, then like, who's the future for? Like, what kind of future are we going to make? Some like stupid techno utopia that's like good for 10 Silicon Valley bros? Like, I don't want to live in that future, right? Like, we all have to create and live into the future that we want to see. And then just like at the most practical level, like leaving women out of these high level decision-making scenarios just means you're just like, we're not going to come up with the best answers because we're like leaving out the brain power of half the planet, right? Like that's just dumb. Like, do you want to succeed? Yes or no? Then like everyone needs to be welcome to bring all of their skills and magic into this work. And so that is another sort of mission of the book, is through showing all of these different ways that people are contributing to climate work, that the book will be really welcoming. That's another reason we put poetry and art. Like we really want it to feel like, no, like come over here. It's okay. Like there's all different kinds of people and we're going to figure it out together. And so that, that sort of means a lot to us. And like, it's an all hands on deck situation. So how do we build sort of like the biggest, strongest team?
In your like talks with some of these, Gen Zers, it's also weird to me that there's, I still think of millennial as like the youngest. And I realized the other day, my youngest sister is a Gen Zer, but, do you have any hypothesis of why you think they get it better than, other generations? It feels like they've very much so adopted this cause, and I think you're right, Ayana. I mean, I think it's interesting about the intersectionality. I never thought of it that way, but I think it's interesting that it comes so easily, where of course, if it's the climate movement, it's also the feminist movement, it's also the racial justice movement,
Yeah. So there are two contributors who both wrote pieces for the first section of the book, which is called Root. Sherry Mitchell, who is an author, a land rights attorney, indigenous leader, teacher, who is, not a Gen Zer. She is, another, yeah, probably a millennial generation removed. And from Shea Bastida, who wrote the opening essay in the book called Calling In, is one of the kind of really wonderful youth leaders. And there was a moment that I will never forget of Sherry and Shea being on stage together at the Omega Institute for a conversation. And Sherry kind of gathering herself, her emotions, because as she said, in the moment, I want to say this to you with a strong voice, that our elders have been telling us for decades that the generation that would be coming into leadership in this moment would be made for this moment. And that like this generation and these young leaders are a fulfillment of prophecy. And it does like, it feels like that to me, because I think, we could put, you could sort of say, well, parents who get it more and they're getting some in school, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, no, they're like way wiser than 15 or 18 gets you, right? Like there's some other, kind of ancestral wisdom that feels like it's like circuiting through the youth climate movement. Yeah. It's just like
kills.
yeah. Yeah.
And to have the first essay be from a now 18-year-old be calling in, I think is really powerful too, because that's something else that young people have been doing, is saying like, come on, right? Like the movement, if Greta Thunberg was still sitting outside the Swedish parliament alone, we would obviously not have a global youth climate movement, right? But like people saw her and said, oh, that seems smart. I'm also very concerned about that. I could also make the sign, right? Like we need followers and leaders. And I think, Catherine came up with this turn of phrase in the writing to begin. Like we need, we need following when wise leadership emerges. And that's something that like these teenage girls have been like, oh yeah, like I know about good trends, and like saving the planet is like the hottest trend. Like we're in, what are we doing? Like Friday? Okay. I'm totally skipping school on Friday with a sign and yelling in the streets. Like who else is coming with me? Right. And it's this kind of like, come on, you guys, like obviously we need to save some stuff and like shake some grownups and like wake them up. Right. It's this vibe of like, of course, you guys, like, of course, government needs to do better. Of course, corporations need to do better. Like, of course, we need to make sure that we are taking care of everyone as we transition, off of fossil fuels. Like, of course, like, why would we not make sure that, coal miners had a good alternative, right? Like, why would we not make sure that like people had access to healthy food? Why would we like let Black people get left behind? Like that's just dumb, right? And so this like incredible moral clarity of this sense of right and wrong that has been corrupted by the years of being sort of forced into compromise is something that is so powerful in this moment. And Alexandria Senor is the other youth climate activist in the book, and her essay is called Dear Grown-ups, and it's just like, adults, like step it up, like get it together, like we are doing our part, like this is not all on us, but we are doing our part. So what are you going to do? And this pairing of like calling in and like saying this is an intergenerational movement, like it's going to take all of us. It's like they have this kind of like, come on everybody, like we're doing this thing. We're all doing this thing that I think is just so stunning, so powerful.
I just want to ask two more questions before I go into everyone else's Q&As. There's some really good questions in there, so I want to make sure I get to those. If you haven't put your question in, please add it to the Q&A. So, of course, it's the election is on everyone's mind. And, I think when we're talking about what is important for our politicians to be focusing on, what is important to us, of course, this issue comes to mind for me personally. But something I think it was you, Catherine, who recently we were talking about the category that the book is in, right? Because it's a book on climate crisis. It's immediately in the book world, it's immediately put into environmental rights or environmental justice. When
climatology, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. But the book is really a political book. I mean, there's a lot of and it's actually interesting to me the way that it's political, because it's a really human book, and the way in which that the certain authors talk about politics, they're talking about humanity, So I just wanted to hear you guys talk a little bit more about that connection. And you just said it's intersectional, and I understand that. But while politics is on everyone's mind, what should we be looking for our politicians? What should we be asking for?
Yeah. There's this amazing trifecta of policy essays in the book, which is Rihanna Gunright, who's one of the lead architects of the Green New Deal, Varshini Prakash, who is one of the co-founders and the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, one of the sort of the premier youth activist movement in the US for pushing for a Green New Deal. And then Maggie Thomas, who is a climate policy expert who's worked on Jay Inslee's campaign, Elizabeth Warren's campaign, is now political director at a policy think tank that's advising the Biden campaign and preparing things for the next Congress. And so the trifecta of these, and I think they're all like 30 nothing, they're like kids, something between like 28 and 31. I don't know. They're young, and they are like three of the people who have changed the face of climate policy in the US, like literally like rewriting the rules of the game, right? Like, and so to hear it from them, like why they do that work, and to hear them describe the stakes, and to hear them talk about how all these dots connect, right? And like, what does it look like for Maggie Thomas? Like, what does it look like to carry the best ideas forward from Inslee to Warren to Biden to Congress? Like, that's the thread that she's trying to draw, right? Like, and it's this very feminine sort of like, fuck your ego, we need the best ideas. Like, that's what we need. Like, I don't care if someone else came up with it first, it is still the best idea. And like, we're going to make that one the thing that we carry forward. And Rihanna, growing up in the south side of Chicago in a super polluted neighborhood, and having asthma, and thinking about like environmental justice from a health perspective, and worrying about her communities, and knowing that like the Green New Deal has to take care of all of those intersections or it just won't work. And Varshini just being like this incredible strategist, like, how do we hold politicians accountable? Like, we are going into their office. We're going to have a sit-in. We're going to make them sign the no fossil fuel pledge. We're going to, like make all the Democratic candidates endorse the Green New Deal. Like, we are going to like dog them until they get it right. And that like trifecta of essays, I think, is so incredible because of their youth, the combination of like youth and power and insights, and just like literally rewriting the rules. I mean, we'll see how many of them become law, but this sense that like the way that we've been doing things is so wrong. And sort of the collective re-envisioning of not just what's possible, but like what is really needed. None of this like, well, this is what is politically feasible, right? Like Varshini's whole thing is like, we're going to change what's possible. We're going to change what's required to get elected. I think that is just, I love that those three pieces are together, and that Maggie, I called her the day after Elizabeth Warren left the campaign and was like, I know you're sad, but I'm going to need you to write an essay about your entire experience advising presidential campaigns, because like that's the thing this book needs. And like now you suddenly have a little bit more time. And so she sort of like wrote through her heartbreak to explain that, like, how do politicians decide what they're going to champion? Like, what does that even look like? Which is I think something most people never get to really understand. Like that we don't tell those stories, right?
I mean, I think as far as the election is concerned, like there has never been a more important or more stark moment to vote climate. We'll not go into the nitty gritty, but like scientists have mapped out sort of the odds of a 2-degree world. So basically like a very hard but more livable future if there is a second term of the current White House, which like I can't even really articulate. And it's basically like that possibility vaporizes. That is, that is terrifying. So to whatever degree, you can help friends, family, whatever, understand that like we really are at this crossroads of still some sliver of possibility and peril, right? And like we've got to take a sharp left towards possibility. And as Ayana was saying, the amazing thing is like there's really great policy work that's been happening since 2016 that's incredibly exciting. Like we're really ready to roll, but we have to win. And we just have to. And then when we win, knock on this desk, we're gonna have to then do the work that Varshni's talking about of making it politically feasible to get the policy that we need. Because what has happened is that the fossil fuel industry has been so successful in their misinformation, deny, delay, block campaigns that like now the timeline that we're talking about for totally reshaping society is like right now. Like this decade, we have to do change on a scale and at a speed that we've never done before. So, it's a real bummer that is where we are. But the only way we get there, and Rihanna puts this so well, is through a massive coordinated economic mobilization that has to come through the federal government. So the days of like, well, maybe a mix of some individual behavior change and some corporate leadership and like some cities doing smart things, like we've needed all of that. It's helped keep solutions moving forward. But like at this point, it has to be, kind of the whole shebang. Yeah. So make those last calls.
Yeah.
Campaign dirty.
I'm like, I gotta call everybody tonight. We have to do it.
And I think what hasn't gotten enough coverage is that Joe Biden has an incredible climate plan. It is the most ambitious, progressive climate plan we've ever seen from a major presidential candidate. Like,
because the climate movement is working.
Because the climate movement is working, right? Like, because his plan was crap in the primary and he became the nominee and everyone was like, Joe, you're going to need to get it together on climate or like these kids aren't going to vote for you, right? They're just not going to be motivated to leave their houses, right? And so I know there's a question from someone about like, how do we like mobilize the youth vote? And it's by leading, like really leading on saving the planet, right? And so the work of Maggie and Rihanna and Varshni, like literally advising the Biden campaign on like, this is what it looks like to get it right. It means like your goal of decarbonizing electricity by 2050 is like useless. We need 2035. And like his plan now aims for 2035. Like that's 15 years. He's cutting off his timeline for complete renewable energy, right? And on the justice side, committed to 40% of resources for climate adaptation going to marginalized communities of color. Like that's huge, like 40% of the funds, right? And so none of that would have happened without the work of so many people across the country. And so I think that is the story about the election that's not getting told, is that like we went from a really crappy Joe Biden plan to like a truly excellent plan. And though there's room for improvement, like that will get us so much of the way there, and then we can take it to the next level. And I think, you know, we've sort of been suckered into thinking that these two candidates are more similar than they are. Like they could not be more different on climate. And that's what I want people to know. But we have essays in the book also that talk about local politics and the importance of like who is on your utility board deciding, are you still buying coal, you know, coal power energy, like who are your local politicians, right? Because it matters, like public transit decisions, or, you know, do you have municipal compost, or you know, all of the other policy frameworks that make implementing solutions possible. So the president, obviously, like that's what this election's like largely about, is like staving off the absolute worst, when we've had the Trump administration roll back 100 environmental policies in the last 4 years. But, you know, up and down the ballot, we really need to be asking, like, you know, what do our judges think on climate? What do our city councilors, like, what's their plan? What about our state representatives, our Congress people? And so there's an essay by Kate Knuth called Becoming a Climate Citizen that talks about like what that means to be a citizen who is really thinking about climate and the future, and sort of having that motivate the way that you show up in the world. So there's a lot of both direct and indirect discussion about sort of politics and policy, and sort of the intersection of those two.
I want you guys to talk about the All We Can Say project before we go to any of these questions. For any of our attendees that are used to our Ideas in Action, you know, events and the way that we normally do it, we have a partner come in, but today our partner is our authors. So if you guys can talk about the project.
Yeah.
Catherine, do you want to give the origin story a little bit too, as you're explaining?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, really kind of the idea for this book, and the idea for a nonprofit that might kind of fill some gaps, where there's kind of consistent, insufficient, or absent support for women leading on climate. We're born in the same moment. So we were in Colorado for this climate summit. Ayana and I had been leading a kind of working session roundtable that day, and we were just like, damn it, like where are all these people? Like, why is it that like all the old white dudes still have the mic all the time on climate? We want them on the team, but like they can't be the only spokespeople for the team. And they definitely don't have all the ideas, or all the like, you know, kind of critical analysis. So Ayana talked earlier about kind of let's bring a book to a whole bunch of amazing women, and kind of the amplification that comes with that. And then we started to really think about the need for community building and the need for resources to make this work, right? So like we know that social movements are so dependent on that like relational strength, right? Like the web between us. And climate philanthropists have always been obsessed with things that have gigaton measurable carbon outcomes, and like relational work, you know, good luck connecting those dots. But like we can look at the history of social movements and know how critical that is. And then there's so much work that women are doing that is like they may be working in climate all the time, every day, but like their most transformational work is happening as a side hustle. Again, because traditional philanthropy isn't seeing it, doesn't know how to fund it, whatever the case may be. So we concepted kind of an award named after Eunice Newton Foote, who opens the book, and she was a scientist and feminist who discovered the connection between carbon dioxide and planetary warming in 1856, published a paper, and then
Can't
was,
say she didn't warn ya.
yeah, I cannot say like we didn't know this was coming, and was basically forgotten. And 3 years later, an Irish physicist who opposed women's suffrage published his own sort of version of that work and is counted as like the grandfather of climate science. And that story of people being stripped of credit, not having sort of sufficient resources and platforms and all of that, like it's still too true of a story today. So we hope to name this the Eunice Newton Foote Award in her honor, and to fund cohorts of women climate leaders at a level that really lets them do their most important work, and for a sufficient number of years that actually lets them do that too. So that's kind of the core of the All We Can Save project. That was kind of a rambly answer.
No, that's great. It just became clear that so we had sort of been thinking about these things in parallel. Like there's a book, and then like eventually we'll get this nonprofit off the ground. But like as we were getting close to the launch of the book, it became clear that they both needed to be born at the same moment. So we kind of like rushed to, at the same time as we were launching the book, be ready to launch the nonprofit. And we couldn't come up with a name for the nonprofit. It was like the Climate Justice Sistership, which is like just a bunch of words. And then we were like, what if we just call it the All We Can Save project? Because it's like the same exact motivation, the same exact vision. It is the start of building that community of women who are leading on climate. And we could just, keep the same website and social handles.
And so we should mention those for who want, because there are 60 incredible contributors. You can read about all of them at allwecansave.earth. And obviously
we were cute coming up with that website.
Yeah. And at All We Can Save. That's our social handle on Twitter and Instagram.
We'll have One World drop that in the chat too. I know that we're running close to time, but I just want to get to a few of the questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
There is one from someone who says that they've never worked in climate or eco or justice systems. They're not a scientist. They don't even have a degree yet. And they feel like they don't fit in anywhere. They're awkward and an introvert. So someone like that, who is one of the few Gen Xers in that's not, I guess, extroverted, but really wants to do something. How does someone like them get involved?
Yeah, I love this question. And unfortunately, the answer is a question, which is like, I don't know. What are you good at? Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning? Like, Catherine and I are word nerds, right? So our contribution can be this book. I'm also a marine biologist by training. So a lot of my work, sort of like when I'm not doing All We Can Save stuff, is at the connection between ocean and climate science and policy. So it just depends, like, are you a web designer? Are you a lawyer? Are you an artist? Are you just like incredibly cool and people listen to whatever you say? Like, do you know a bunch of rich people? Like, what magic do you have, right? Because like we're at this moment where we just need everyone to bring their best, like bring us your magic and sparkles, your special skills, and figure out how to plug those in. I think one of the failings, honestly, of the environmental movement, the climate movement, has been everybody march, everyone donate, everyone vote, everyone bring your own reusable bag and like obsess over your carbon footprint, even though the whole concept of a carbon footprint was invented by fossil fuel companies as a marketing campaign to make us all worry about our own stuff instead of changing systems. So enough with that. Like, we need to focus on the big picture. Do your part. All those things are important. Like, please vote, please donate, please show up in the streets, like do all those things. But like, we're missing so much if that's all we ask of people, right? Like, farmers have a huge role to play in this, in shifting agriculture so that soils can start absorbing carbon instead of releasing it, right? Journalists obviously have a huge role to play. Artists have an enormous role to play. We have to envision a whole nother way of living on this planet and with each other. So, I mean, that's what this book is kind of encouraging people to do, is like, think about like, what are you good at and how can you bring this to this work? And there is plenty of room for introverts. Like, this whole, like, I am I know this will surprise a lot of people, but I am happy to not talk to anyone for like weeks at a time and just like sit in my house. Like I am a secret introvert, and there's plenty of room for everybody. And I think the other part of that is like join something, right? Like don't just like stress out by yourself thinking like, but I don't know how to save the planet. It's like, well, no one can do it alone. And so at the back of the book, to sort of facilitate that, we have a list of all of the organizations that are mentioned in the book. Because the hope is that you get to the end and you see like, okay, like, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to join? And so you can scan this list and see like, oh, well, I remember in that essay, they mentioned this group, and like, maybe I can volunteer with that group, or maybe I could get a job with that group. And that's the name of the game, right? And then Catherine, from her work at Project Drawdown, it put in the appendix a whole list of all the climate solutions that we already have at our fingertips, on hand and ready to go. Like maybe one of those inspires you and you want to get involved in like a specific solution or a specific organization. And so, so read the appendix, I guess. Read the appendices is my advice to you.
And my one sentence addition is, anyone who gives you a simple answer to that question is underselling your potential to contribute.
Unless they know you super well.
Yeah, yes, that's true. But like, yeah, those like checklists of like the top 5 things you can do, they are never actually the top 5 things. And they never are kind of personal enough to be about your superpowers.
Okay, this one last question, which I'm gonna kind of put together 2 questions, which is how can we integrate more of these diverse ideas and perspectives into academic institutions, especially in fields that are traditionally scientific and quantitative? And then someone else asked a similar question of how can we integrate more of these diverse ideas into companies?
Catherine, do you want to take the academia piece?
Sure. I mean, gosh, academia is not a change effort that I would be like sign up to lead. Like that's, it's a hard institution.
But you kind of are. I mean, that's one of the pillars of All We Can Say project.
This is true. Like sometimes I think the answer to that is like circumvent, go around, see if you can get people to teach this book. No, but I think that some of it is that that students are going to be pushing for it because they are asking different questions than I heard people asking when I was in undergrad, in the early 2000s. Like that has changed. And so I think part of it will be that academia is going to have to adapt to be relevant for people who are trying to, figure out how to live and how to lead in this century, which is going to demand this kind of intersectional, cross-disciplinary, mosaic-like approach. And I think that a topic like climate actually kind of grabs academic silos and like shakes the shit out of them, right? Because it's like, well, what's going on here? What do you mean those aren't connecting to these and whatever. So I think, I don't know, maybe the climate crisis itself will kind of reshape some of that.
Yeah. So for the All We Can Save project, there's the Eunice Newton-Foote Award, which Catherine described. But then also this idea of broader community building using the book. And then the third piece is education. So thinking about how we can actually develop curricula for middle school, for high school, and then college professors can kind of do whatever they want. Catherine's teaching the book at Sewanee right now, university. There's like half a dozen or maybe now a dozen different professors at universities across the US who are putting this book into their curriculum. And so that is another important piece of it. And just as an excuse to mention it, we are launching next week something called All We Can Save Circles, which is basically like an extended remix of a book club. So the book is built into 10 sections. Each, 8 of those core ones have 4 or 5 essays and a few poems and quotes and art. And so each week will be a discussion of a different section. And so if people are wanting to really like go more deeply into discussion of the book, like gather your friends, gather your crew, whoever you want to be reading this with, and allwecansave.org/circles. On our website, it has lots of information about what that entails. You'll get lovely emails from Catherine and occasionally me talking about like, okay, so this week, this is what we're doing. And here's what that looks like, and sort of the opportunity to go into this more deeply, and to use this as sort of the transition from education to action, and to sort of tease the answer to the corporate question. There are companies who have bought this book for all of their employees, and who are doing reading circles in their companies. Nike bought 75 books, and Interface bought hundreds of books, and Stella McCartney and Mara Hoffman and Patagonia, and like all these companies are using this as a way to talk about these issues in more nuance. So, I think corporations certainly do have a significant role to play. Catherine's done a lot of work with corporations, helping them understand sort of like how much potential they have that they're not using for being part of the climate solution. So yeah, I think all of those dots, are connected, and like all of these threads are weaving through the book. And so it's honestly just been like such an incredible experience, Catherine, to team up and figure out like how much we can smash between these two covers together, and like how pretty can we make it, and how sort of accessible, and like not fancy science and big words. It's just like, give it to them straight, that vibe, Nicole, that you mentioned at the beginning. And the last thing I'll say is that we actually explain the title in the last essay of the book. There's a paragraph for each word. What does all really mean in this context? What does we, and what is can, and what is save? And I'm just very grateful that Catherine let me leave this in the book. The line at the beginning of the can paragraph that basically says, this shit ain't over yet. Right? Like, what are we gonna, like, there's still so much possibility. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, is like, what can I contribute to making sure we have the best possible future?
I want to end there. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight, and thank you for all your hard work and your wisdom. And I'm just gonna go call everyone and
for
say
all your guidance, Nicole, and all your help along the way. It's been just like amazing to have you be our partner in this. Catherine, will you show the back of the book? This is Nicole's other major thing.
In addition to helping the book find a name, so these are, you will notice, these are not blurbs. These are all of the contributors, the essayists, the poets, and Madeline in her own category as illustrator. And this just felt, now this is the same way as with the poetry. I'm like, this is the only way that the back of the book could have been authentic. Nicole, we really are like incredibly grateful to have gotten to work with you on this.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Don't make me cry in front of everyone.
Reconvene here in 5 minutes and then cry.
Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll send out the YouTube link tomorrow for everyone. Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.